Thank you very much. My wife is sitting back in the corner there. Raise your hand, is Tony. And we traveled to London just 8 days ago, and we've made the most of it so far. We've been able to meet 11 different MPs in this 8-day period, and we've had, this was the fourth one of the lectures, and each one of the lectures has been different. So it's kind of fun because I make the lectures up as I go along. But I think you'll find it interesting. Just in terms of background, I was having a great difficulty when I was in college at San Diego State University, and I found an organization and took a class in economics that kind of changed my life. And it's kind of the background because the slides I'm going to tell you, I got into the whole field of assessment because of this experience in my college years. I'm going to do it on PowerPoint, and there'll be time for questions both as we go along and at the end. And I hope then following to have some good discussion to answer principles that you want to bring up. I'm going to sit down while I go through the PowerPoint. First of all, the topic is land rental capture. And to start with, land rent is the best source of public revenue. It's the best way of funding a government. It's the best way of funding a community. Land is a free gift of nature. Land rental is an economic surplus that belongs to everyone and is adequate to fund all public needs. Now those are pretty strong statements, but they're pretty true. And I know that they're the things that I started my career in. Land is a free gift of nature. Men do not produce land value. Land value is produced by the community of men who all want to use land and can see its highest and best use. So to think that a person creates land value is just not true. It's a community created value, and largely it's based upon what's available in terms of natural resources and location. Everyone wants to have the best location for their business because they can have a higher income by using the best location. They want to be close to public transit. They want to have all the amenities that are possible. Well, along the way, I've discovered that there is enough value in community-created land value to fund all public needs. And I'm going to show you how I've been able to prove that we could eliminate, for example, sales taxes like VAT taxes. There's no reason to have them. We can eliminate council taxes. We could eliminate business taxes, stamp taxes, all the kinds of taxes that we currently have. And in fact, we could eliminate individuals having to contribute to the National Health Service because the value of land is that great. And just to kind of give you a background, there's over $1 trillion of land value evident in the United Kingdom today. Only a small amount of land rent is captured for public purposes. And this is kind of the tragedy of what's happening. Although this is a free source that belongs to all of us, we go out and raise revenue from all the other things that that people produce and so forth, instead of capturing the land rental value. Only a very small portion is captured today. In the United Kingdom, it's possible to estimate the total rental value of all the land quickly, accurately, and at a reasonable cost. I was asked, well, it can't be done, it will take years to do that. Now I'm going to give you an example of where it was done in exactly 1 year. And it could be done in the United Kingdom in 1 year. I'm going to give you some of my own background so that you get some sense of what I'm talking about. In 1975, I was appointed as the Assessment Commissioner and Chief Executive Officer of British Columbia Assessment. And I was there from 1975 to 1986. That's like a position of Deputy Minister of Finance for the province of British Columbia, Canada. The existing records in the British Isles, we already have a lot of information about assessments and what land values are. It's not something that we don't know. We have the valuation office that sets the council taxes, we have the business tax, and we have been using the Eurostat compilation guide. British Columbia is on the west coast of Canada, and it is 3.9 times larger than the United Kingdom. That's in land area. The BC government wanted to improve the property tax and capture a greater proportion of revenue from land and natural resources. The assessments had been frozen in British Columbia for 30 years, similar to how they're now frozen with the council taxes that were set up in the 90s. In 1973, I was hired as a consultant. I had a lot of assessment experience in the United States, but none in Canada. But they wanted to use the expertise that I had developed. And I was given a period of time and made some recommendations to the all-party committee of the legislature and gave them, the background that I recommended. I recommended that there be a province-wide agency. There had been municipal assessments done by each of the 140 municipalities in the city, but I felt like it could be done by a central agency much better, and it could be done at a lower cost. And I recommended that there be annual reassessments of land, and that land and improvements should be separately shown so that you'd have a total of land on one side, a total of buildings on the other side, and the total would be the market value. In order to get it going, we had to develop new systems and set up mapping and assessment roles and reports and the various appraisal systems. The government only gave our new agency 1 year. They said, you have 1 year, get it done. And from day one, it was exactly 1 year to finish off the job of setting up the structure of this province-wide agency. And I think that we were successful in that because we're able to develop the systems that really made things work. The objective that they had in British Columbia was to capture land rent, which was a plentiful source of public revenue, and to reduce taxes on buildings, workers, homeowners, producers, and merchants, so that it would enhance the wealth of all people. And today, this was all done 44 years ago, so that they've had 44 years of using this system in British Columbia. And all the land has been updated every year for the last 44 years. So to say that it's an impossible job is just not true. Back when we did the first job, we had the use of computers, but they were, pretty mediocre computers back in those days. In 73, 74, you didn't have the types of telephones that we can do regression analysis on just like that. But we use the computers of the day, and we've been able to update the assessments ever since for the 44 years. And we do now use the most technical techniques that there are in terms of capturing data and processing data. Just in terms of numbers, in British Columbia, they currently collect $7.9 billion in property tax, and $4 billion comes from land. And this is what provides all the services and infrastructure for the province of British Columbia. And the population is 475 million compared to England's 55 million. And we have been able to actually set up everything so we have all the things in place. And the total value of all real estate today in in British Columbia is just under $2 trillion. So I'm asked, how did we do it? And basically, we did it just the way that logically you would think about any assignment you were given. We developed a land database. We then studied comparable rentals and comparable sales, and we developed models, and then we applied the models. There's a number of techniques that can be used for estimating the rental value of land. The most common one, and the one that's currently used here in the United Kingdom, is land rental comparisons with adjustments. There are many properties that are on lease where you have good rental information. Every sale that occurs has both a selling price of the land and the improvement. It's a very simple thing to allocate out what portion is land and what portion is improvement. So this gives you a pretty much a universal database of information on land rental values and on land values. So it's easy to move forward with the data, but there's 4 other techniques that I'm not going to get into tonight that allow you to also estimate the values of rent. So just looking at the land rental comparison, the best are ground let leases. And tear down sales are really sales of vacant land. And then the land residual sales are where you separate out the land from the building, and any sale price times the cap rate is a rental rate. So developing the rental rate for land is a very simple thing. The assessors make up adjustment charts because you need to set up values for districts around the countries. You need to make adjustments for all the differences that you have. And you always use land value maps. You always use colorful land value maps. In this particular jurisdiction, the dark blue and purple are the most valuable properties. They're down on the waterfront. And the greener ones are the next valuable set, and then the light green ones are the least valuable land values. But you're able to see on a map. And what's good about these maps is that people can then look at the map of their neighbor and they can see how their property compares to their neighbor's property, and how, the people that are further away are paying less, the people that are closer to the amenities are paying more. That's why the land value maps are so important. I'm going to skip over the other because they get to be technical. The next question I wanted to answer is land adequate to fund all public purposes. And I'm going to give 4 examples. I'm currently living in California, where I was an assessor. We have an example in Australia, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and here in Great Britain. California has been saddled with a terrible law that's known as Proposition 13, which limits the amount of increase that any land parcel can have to 2% or less per year. Now, the land values in California have been going up at like 7, 8, 10%. So it means that the property tax base, which is the primary revenue source for all the municipalities, has been declining as time goes on because they weren't able to raise the assessments. This has been good in terms of stabilizing the values for the property owners, but it's been terrible for the municipalities in terms of raising revenue. So in California, there was a proposition put forward to change Proposition 13. California, just for comparison, is 1.75 times larger in size than the United Kingdom. And in terms of population, just under 40 million people, whereas the United Kingdom has over 55 million people. California's estimated real property value is 8.36 trillion. Just a rough estimate of the United Kingdom value would be at least $2 trillion, probably much more. So this proposition was to change Proposition 13 so that we could eliminate taxes on sales, on income, on buildings, and replace all the lost revenue with a charge of 75% annual tax on the rental value of land. And that unfortunately did not go through because you had to get the signatures of 8% of all the people in California, which was going to cost a lot of money. But had it gone through, we would have replaced the $159 billion in revenue that was required in California, and we would have had a surplus of $43 billion collected. So in essence, California proved that it could be done. Australia has also proved that it could be done. In Australia, the economists there figured out that by that the amount of revenue from land would be equivalent to 25% or greater of the total gross domestic product in Australia. They did all the calculations and came up with this. And they've been using this, saying that somewhere between 25 and 50% of gross domestic product would fund everything. This chart shows Australia is kind of interesting because right now, the gray at the top is the land rental value that is retained by private investors. The red, the top red bar, is the amount that they're currently collecting in land rental values. The lighter red is the total that they're collecting in all other forms of taxes, VAT taxes, income taxes, and so forth. And the blue at the bottom shows what actually goes to the workers, the producers, the entrepreneurs in Australia. The idea that we had there is to do away with all of that red by taking more of the gray. And then the people who actually do the work in Australia, the producers, the businessmen, the workers, and so forth, would be keeping all the blue plus all of the light red so that their wages would go up, their produce would go up, their economy would go up.
And who would lose? I mean, this is interesting, isn't it? Like who, the grey bit, who's that going to come from?
The gray bit is going to come from all of the people that are currently collecting the rental value. All land has rental value, collecting the rental value because they have a title to it. And in essence, basically, the land belongs to everybody, but because through time they've been able to get a title, they've been able to claim all the rental value of land. And this is whether they use it or not. And that's basically those who are misusing it would be the ones. I'll get into specific details because we've done a lot of research on that already. We basically figured out, for example, that in California, 80% of homeowners would pay less in these land rental taxes, and the only ones who would pay more are ones that had large acreages associated with their homes, not for farming or not for productive use, but basically for speculative use. So to answer the question, those that are involved in land speculation would be the ones that would be paying the higher price. Those that were farmers or workers or homeowners, generally speaking, would be paying lower under this new system. I did a second example was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Harrisburg is the capital city in Pennsylvania, and for years it had been known as it was known as the most depressed city in the United States. You know, you look at on a chart of the 200 cities, it was the worst city to live in the United States. Harrisburg had a serious problem, but they had a mayor that took on the challenge, and this was 30 years ago. he decided that he would raise more of the revenue from land values and collect less and less from buildings and taxes and on commerce and so forth. So over a period of 20 years, he gradually raised the taxes on land to where now, in this one city, they have a tax rate on land that is 6 times higher than the tax rate on buildings. So what's happened over the 20 years since he's put this in place? Well, new investment has increased in Harrisburg. It has left being the worst city in the United States to being one of the most dynamic cities, creating more investment goods, more businesses located there. They cut the vacant properties by 85%. They reduced the crime rate by 54%, and the fire rate dropped by 76%. That's basically people now in Harrisburg are beneficiaries of the fact that they're raising revenues from a common source as opposed to the day-to-day working source that had been used in the past.
And can that actually be tracked to, I mean, was anything else going on during that time? I mean, can that all be tracked back to the change in tax?
There were many other things that were going on at the same time, and the mayor made that point very clearly,
Yeah.
that he used all of the things that he possibly could use to enhance it. And certainly he considered this to be the most important one, but he considered all of the other opportunities that mayors and that communities were given to take advantages of other means of enhancement to the community. So the economic results are that land now costs less, the rents that people are paying are down, new businesses were started, new investment in production, new jobs, wages increased, and everyone benefited, including the poorest people. So let me get down to Great Britain then. I've estimated the gross domestic product in Great Britain in last year as being just over $2 trillion. And using the low figure of Australia of 25%, that would be $500 billion that could be used right away by simply collecting the rental value of the land. I'm going to finish by just giving this this quote from Joseph Stiglitz. Much of the inequality in our economy has been the result of rent seeking, because to a significant degree, rent seeking redistributes money from those at the bottom to those at the top. Rent seeking distorts resource allocations and production. So in essence, that's what I wanted, that's the background I wanted to give you. Now, in terms of my own experience, I've worked in over 190 different cities in the United States and Canada. And what I found is whenever more revenue is raised from land and less from buildings and less from production, you see economic benefits. You see economic benefits wherever you look. In particular, you see there's more homes constructed. You see that there's more economic opportunities for business and so forth. So that's been my own personal experience. And I think at this point, I've kind of given you the background. I'd welcome questions and discussion of what I've talked about.
Can I, just before opening it, ask you just to reflect on the politics of those changes that you study? Because it's usually, when various political parties here have tried to introduce the idea of land value tax, they seem to fail in the politics of explaining it, or there's a backlash, or it's always the story, I think, of the widow in the large house who suddenly is poverty-stricken because they're paying a large amount of tax. How did the people who've been successful at introducing these reforms, how did they manage to build the political momentum to do it?
Let's take British Columbia first. And British Columbia, there had been a period of complacency and not growing like people had wanted to see growth. And they looked back and they saw that much of this was due to the fact that they were just not a dynamic community. There was in 1972 a NDP government elected, a liberal government, and they came in with several policies that they based their campaign on. The one was to raise more revenue from land and natural resources.
So this was a right-wing, a conservative government.
No, this was
Sorry.
it had been, and it went to a liberal government.
Okay, liberal in our, yeah, okay. A liberal government, right?
Yep. A liberal government had taken place, and they had three major things. One was to collect more revenue from land. Another one was to revamp the ferry system, major transportation between Victoria and Vancouver, and it was running very inefficiently. And the third major campaign was to redo the insurance. We're on the West Coast, they were paying 5 times higher for automobile insurance than people were anywhere else, and it made no sense. So they actually had to take over the insurance function and come up with a state type of insurance function that would compete with the private sector. So the Liberal government had these campaign issues, and they won the election. Not only did they win the election, but all three of these things that they set aside to impart all stayed in place till today. So they were accepted by all the seceding governments afterward. And the government basically wanted to see the improvements done, and they said, we want this assessment system set up in 1 year, and we did it. We set everything in motion so that 1 year later we had it in place. So I hear all the stories here in London and in Great Britain. One, you don't have the talent to do it. You do. You have chartered surveyors, you have government agencies that have experts on them. You have the talent to do it. 2, it will take 5 years to do it. It won't. It can be done in 1 year. It's been done many places in the world in 1 year. If you decide to do it, it will be done. It can be done that fast.
And was there a lobby when because you were there? I mean, was there a sort of backlash? Did the opposition try to lobby to stop it? Was there adverts? What did they fight against the change or not?
There was no lobby against it.
There was no lobby against it.
No lobby against it.
No lobby against it.
In fact, we had several lobbies for it. The major lobbies for it were the Municipal Association. The 180 cities all were part of the province-wide Municipal Association. They lobbied for it. They saw that it made sense. The school districts lobbied for it. They saw that it made sense. One of the bigger changes we did was we imposed the school tax province-wide on everybody, even those places where they didn't have schools. For example, the forest areas and the mining areas where there weren't schools, for the first time paid a school tax. So by coming up with these formulas, there was no one opposed to it. The real estate industry was a supporter of it because they could see that it was going to enhance the land values over time and create the opportunity for all this growth, new construction. The construction industry was all for it. You come down to who was against it, and I can't really name any group that was against it. And it was adopted unanimously by an all-party committee. And there was 5 different parties in British Columbia at that time, and this was the most liberal one that established it, but the most conservative ones also went along with it, and all the parties approved it unanimously at the legislature. Now, I know this is not going to happen in Great Britain. I've met 11 MPs this week, and they have told me these horrible stories. And they say, it's impossible. And I say, well, we did it. I know other places that have done it, so it is possible. They say, but you need studies. And I said, well, we've given you a few studies here already. You've done studies. You can look at Denmark. They've had this in place right here in the EU region. And why have more studies? So, everything they came up with was nonsensical. And they say, well, and then the homeowner or the elderly homeowner. What we do, not only in British Columbia, but really throughout North America, is very simple. When you get to be 65 years of age, you can defer your property taxes. You don't have to pay them. And you have to, eventually the property will be sold, and the taxes would be paid that were deferred at that point. But it takes away the whole issue of forcing people out of their homes. Certainly, you know, there's no reason to do that. Virtually any kind of problem you can come up with has a solution. Now, some of the bigger texts, some of the, you asked earlier about who was paying more. Some of the bigger increase went to the utility companies, the natural resource companies, because they had been taking resources out of British Columbia and for the most part transporting them to Japan at the time. Coal, timber, agricultural products, all kinds of things were being sent to Japan. And they were virtually paying the government nothing for these resources. They were just cutting down trees and sending them. So this put in motion now that resources industry should pay property taxes and should have to pay just like homeowners have to pay. So there was a lot of new revenue that was brought in. That was another reason it was popular. We also found a lot of properties that had not even been registered. And I understand here in Great Britain, there's a good 20% or more of properties that are not registered in the United Kingdom. And, you know, those will bring in new revenues that have not been secured in the past. The same happened in British Columbia. We picked up about 20% of new properties that had never paid any taxes in the past. So there was a lot of pluses basically by really just making this organization happen. And we've yet to find the downside of it because there isn't any downside that we have found.
So why did these 11, what was your take on these 11 MPs you met who all had this sorry tale to tell you? Why do you think they believe, you know, where was it coming from? Did you get any sense of that?
They fear being reelected. I mean, they virtually tell you that. They say that they fear by going with something as dramatic as this, that they may lose their electorate. And so it's fear. It's fear of the unknown. And some of them will even admit that they think they could do this and it would make sense. But yet they don't want to be the first ones. They don't want to be the one that stands up and says, this is what we're going to do, you know. So as a result, they put it aside. They say, well, that's the next generation that can figure out this problem.
Because I suppose they figure that it's always the losers who make more noise than the winners, isn't it?
And
but is there experience of, I mean, you talked about Harrisburg, where it had been sort of gradually brought in, hasn't it? I mean, you can imagine if you do something dramatically, which changes things hugely, but did you point out that, you know, there's a way of sort of gradually doing this?
Yes. Yeah, I always make that point. And, you know, just logically speaking, here in the Great Britain, I would say go after your worst taxes first. You know, I would get rid of the council tax, get rid of the business tax, and the stamp tax. You know, those are small items. There's only like $30 million in those pots, in each of those pots. So, you know, that's only going to take part of the revenue. You still have a lot of revenue after that you can start doing away with other things and start looking at the worst taxes and getting rid of the worst taxes first. But I would say that over a period of maybe 10 years, you'd be rid of all taxes. You wouldn't even have to have a health insurance tax, because there's enough revenue to fund everything in government. You don't really have to fund things from people's effort if you have ample sources to fund them from a natural basis.
Well, where can we start?
Okay, questions?
We'll take a question from Michael.
It's a technical thing, is it?
If you could give your name and then...
Anthony Malloy from the Labour Land Campaign. The methodologies, Ted, that you gave all seem to me to give you permitted use value. Like LVT, is some of the things that they push is, you know, they'll stop speculation and it'll optimise land use. But I mean, a lot of speculation is based on hope value, and as long as you're taxing on permitted use, you don't really pushing towards optimising land use.
Let me reconstruct your question. In essence, yes, permitted use is how you value. You know, as a chartered surveyor or an appraiser, the first thing you do before you do any appraisal is you value the land. And to do that, you have to estimate the highest and best use. And that highest and best use is the permitted value. Now, sometimes you have a likeliness that a permitted value will be changed, likely. So that in appraisal theory, many appraisers have built that in to like a value as is and a value, a future value. So it is possible to realize that by getting better permits to do construction, you can go on. The advantages that land value taxes often raise are that they stimulate the proper use of land, the proper development of land. They stimulate the improving of rundown property or slum type property. They encourage the development of vacant lots so that you deal with the housing situation in that way. That everyone, when they're faced with a land tax that hits them harder than typical people, they say, well, what do we have to do to get a greater revenue from our land? And if it's vacant, it's improve it, or sell it to someone else who would like to improve it. Or if it's run down, fix it up so that you can get a higher rental from it. It's basically to do good for the community, which will be doing good for yourself, increasing your revenue.
Right.
It's just, I wasn't clear whether, when you say.
What was your name?
Bruno, I'm one of the students in economics. Replacing all taxes, does that include income tax?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
yes. Income taxes, definitely.
Okay.
I just want to check.
Your
with
name,
you.
is it?
Andrew Bergman. I'm here partly here to try and communicate some information about my book that I've written. It's about land tax. What of the per country? Could you give an estimation of what amount of the actual rent would be needed to take in as a land tax to be the most efficient, so that you cover all the costs? Is there a kind of figure that you could kind of estimate?
We're not going to be able to answer that question until you actually start collecting land rent. You'll then know. What we do know is that roughly the total expenditures of everything, including the health tax and all the other taxes in the United Kingdom, is about 800 million. Yeah, just under less than $1 trillion, about 800 million.
Billion. Billion.
Billion, I'm sorry.
In art.
Thank you. 800 billion.
800 million would not be a lot.
You don't go from 1 million to 1 trillion. You go from 1 billion to 1 trillion.
Yeah.
So we know that 800 billion. Now we know that the potential rental in the United Kingdom varies somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion. So theoretically, you should be able to replace everything with a tax of 80% of the rental value of land. If you were only dealing, with those initial taxes, it would be a fairly small rate. It needed like 60 billion right away. That would be a very small rate on land. So it depends upon what you want to fund through land and what you are willing to fund through people's efforts and so forth. That's your
And
decision.
the political story that you
Yep.
could tell, that because presumably if you sell it on the basis you're going to replace some really bad things that people hate, then people accept that, and then you
Yep.
you can build on that. What's
Right.
Sorry?
Yeah, hi, Liam, I'm a student at Greenwich. My question is, in countries like the UK, where the politicians in power have so much riding on land speculation, like 20% of British MPs are landlords. So how do you make it politically viable for them, and how do you ensure that once, the first stages of a land tax are implemented that they're not lobbied against to be revoked.
And did you ask the MPs that you were talking to whether how much of their income came from land rental?
Well, my background when I was in college is my father was a prominent real estate broker, and I was in line to take over his business and become a prominent real estate broker. And I became so fascinated in this, and of course the first question I asked was, well, won't it hurt those of us that own speculative land and that are involved in, the sale and brokerage of land? And I've answered the question for myself that basically, once you have a productive society, those people that are privileged enough to have titles to land are going to have greater opportunities to build upon and use their land properly. So that in essence, everyone is going to be better off, even those that have to pay more initially because they're holding out valuable land. It betters all society, including those in the real estate business. And so, I do know that the one MP I spoke with was talking about, how he's a land speculator. And I just told him, frankly, you got two ways to go. You can go the way things are going right now and not contribute to society, or you can go with something that makes sense, which is using commonly created values for everyone's good, and you'll then have the opportunity to develop your property and develop it to its highest and best use. I don't know if I convinced him, but at least I gave him an answer.
Is this sort of similar to the great sort of insight that Ford had, that if he paid his employees enough to buy his cars, then then it would sort of work instead of trying to pay as little as possible, and you don't have a business. Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to recap. Sorry, I'm Shariar. I'm an economics student at SOAS. Thank you for your talk. So let's say the net. I'm just making this up, but let's say the net operating income is $10, whatever it could be, 10 million, 10 billion, doesn't matter, right? And the capitalization rate is, let's say, 10%, so 0.1. So whatever, the value of the land would be then 100 million or just $100, doesn't matter, right? And so when you're talking about the tax, or you're talking about the net operating income, because right, because otherwise you can't tax, because it's, in some ways land values are sort of mythical, right? They depend on capturing an income stream, which can vary from year to year. So then you would tax. So by land value tax, you would say 75%, so you get 750 of the net operating income.
That's correct.
So okay, so then how come you would think that every landlord would be up in arms against you? They would be like, oh my God, you're taking away 3/4 of my income, right? This is sort of like what Henry George's point was too, or Keynes's point, that's why they were on TA, they'll fight to the death for this, right? You would think that there would be a huge lobby against it. I'm for it, but so I don't know. That is just not ignorance, but there's actually people whose basically wealth you would have to remove for this to happen.
You started off by doing a good explanation that we're talking about net operating income, or net income that the land receives. That's after you have paid for all the improvements and all the maintenance and all the expenses and so forth. It's the net amount that's attributable to the land, and that capitalized gives it its market value. The argument is, if you're taking less than 100%, if you're taking 50%, you're still leaving enough there to have a very high market value on the land. And although I know that, in Henry George's case, he wanted to take almost all of it so that there would be no market value to land. But as long as there was some market value to land, it would be there. You would be able to see it, and you'd be able to check the moves that you made, so that as you moved ahead by improving your property, you would see it, and you would meet the demand that was incumbent in your market. I think to answer your question, it's a market function, and I think here you would not start off with 75% of the economic rent. You start off with a much smaller amount, and you'd have a large capital value remaining on the land.
And with the interest, just to go into practicalities, so say you have a property, so you're a landlord, you have a property, you have a 50% mortgage on the property, so you're paying a certain amount of interest, as well as obviously the maintenance and so forth, you've got a certain rental income. To get back to the sort of net operating, would you be able to count the interest expense or not? And how would that play in? Because then you wouldn't, I suppose, be able to afford to take out mortgages to pay the interest to invest.
You know, it used to be not that many years ago that few banks would lend massive amounts of money on land because they use the same math that you just used. This is a situation where the banks now are deeply involved in land speculation along with the land speculators, and they're going to feel some impact in also having to see that the land gets used properly. This is going to be true of all people. You know, it's going to be those people who do not make proper use of their land are going to be the ones winding up holding the bag. The point is that there is such demand for housing, demand for everything, that we don't see this coming. We see that this is a matter of fulfilling the needs that people have.
But so suddenly this tax starts going up, wouldn't people just try and put the rents up to recover the extra tax they had to pay? Or, I mean, how would that, and given that there is a lack of housing and so forth, would that just push up rental costs?
Unfortunately, rents cannot be increased because of taxation. Rents are a function of you pay the least that you can for what you want. And whether your rent is, the taxes cannot be passed on. Land is unique from everything else in the economy, and that land is a fixed supply, and you're not able to export your land somewhere else or to do anything with it. It's fixed in location, and that's what people are paying for, is the location. And you cannot pass, like if you wanted to rent a home, you're going to rent the home that satisfies your needs, that has the lowest price on it. And because the taxes go up, you're not going to be able to pass those taxes on, because he's going to continue looking for the best deal that he can find.
Even if all the landowners are deep in, debt and all sort of, everyone puts up and people got to live in London. So, do they leave to go somewhere else?
They're going to stay in London, but they're going to pay only what they have to in terms of market. And you have a very strong market in London, and what's going to happen is that you're going to find that competition will be so great with new construction going on that you'll actually find that rentals will not go up. They'll tend to stabilize.
And this is because a lot of the undeveloped land
Yes,
will suddenly, that there'll be a momentum to actually develop them.
that's right.
Okay. Adam.
Yeah, can I just thank you. My name's Adam Timmer. I work in a music data company, but I have an interest in economics. I just wanted to touch on, you keep saying that a lot of the arguments in British Columbia were, the reason why so many people were on board is because they wanted to move forward, they wanted to develop, and they wanted to, and that city as well, it's the town you mentioned, they wanted some economic stimulus. But I'm just wondering how this idea ties into the kind of post-growth kind of ideas in economics, where we're not trying to constantly stimulate people to do even more development, we're trying to actually get people to move away from a growth model, Could you say something about that? I mean, I know that you're talking about resource use by the lumber companies and resource mining, so maybe it goes both ways, I don't know.
You find that when property is used that should be used, that it frees up land that really shouldn't be used because it's sprawl, it's premature use, so that it reduces your amount of sprawl in your communities. It enhances the productivity within your civic centers, but it reduces the values of the suburban type districts. and it makes farming more productive, and it makes secondary uses. In British Columbia, we saw that many people went into artisan type uses of land because the land in the remote areas was very cheap, and they could produce goods, furniture, and other things very inexpensively, and it was a boom to them in that they were able to find a new career. So it varies from place to place, but the great thing about developing a city properly is it frees up premature development in the suburbs and further out, and it frees up farms so that they can produce farm goods and not be saddled with being converted to residential suburbs.
I'll take you.
No, yeah, thank you. Hi, my name's Carla. I'm a Soros economics student as well. And I was wondering, so since land is fixed and hence the direction of the tax payments will be fixed as well, you haven't talked about corporate taxes or finance transaction taxes, but could that be a mechanism of an tax evasion or a competition? And if so, have you talked to like EU officials about it? There would be an interest in that.
Yeah, I didn't understand the question. Can you?
So this is that
Sorry?
you could get rid of taxes that are actually subject to a lot of evasion.
Of competition, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
That you can just like get rid of
Yes.
taxes within the European Union, and if it's
Yes.
fixed to land, then you can like
Yeah, yes.
basically tax corporations much better, and like hold them accountable instead of like just seeing when you.
Certainly, it would do away with a lot of evasion of taxes because when you have a land tax, you really can't evade it. It's solid, it's there. Whereas if you have other kinds of taxes, other kinds of speculative taxes and so forth, you can evade them. And this is the one tax you cannot evade. So people would tend away from the types of activities that would require tax evasion.
But I mean, just to add, I mean, obviously some of the biggest and most powerful and richest companies we have at the moment, all their assets are intangible. The Googles and Facebooks and so forth, and probably have very little land.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't they be big winners from this? I mean, they avoid
Yes.
probably avoid most tax anyway, but
They would be definitely big winners. Yes.
But then if you restructure, they could have a mechanism of exactly like stopping the structure of tax evasion. If you have like a mechanism not only on land itself, but also like, I don't know, profits, like, if it's not only binding to income and net income, but also like corporate profits or whatever.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but in essence, you would do away with the need to hide profits. Well, profits basically would be earned upon what you do. I don't even call them profits. They would be basically rewards for your effort, for your work.
I mean, I think.
sorry, Tony was asking.
Absolutely respond to that.
Oh, Tony, do you want to?
Yeah, Tony Allen, King's College in SOAS. In the 30 or 40 year period that's been the span of your analysis, another process came into being, environmental economics, which has morphed into environmental capital. And as far as the UK is concerned, UK government, at least the Treasury, has sort of begun to engage with that, whereas apparently not with this much better idea which you have. But I care about the environment, water, and it's never valued. Is there some way of valuing ecosystems in your system?
Yes, there is. By the way, a land value tax has been adopted by the Green Party in Canada, the United States, and many of the countries in the world. Your question had to do with valuing the ecosystems. I think that most people don't realize the value of the electromagnetic field that each country has. It's part of the ecosystem, and we can collect enormous amounts of rent. There should be tax on polluting, for example. I mean, if you're destroying the environment, well, first of all, you should not be allowed to destroy the environment, but there are certain things that will destroy the environment. Certainly a tax on that negative action should be imposed, and this is definitely being considered in Canada and many of the states in the United States, where they are imposing fees for carbon emissions and so forth. And I know even in California where I live, you know, they plan on eventually having all electric cars in California, and that's not too far down, that's in 2030. So I think that there's all kinds of things that can be done to enhance the environment, and all kinds of ways of measuring the value of the environment. In British Columbia, for example, when trees are cut down, they have to be replaced. You know, you just don't go through and chop down a forest and leave it. You have to then replace for the future. And over a period, all the trees that are cut down will be replenished. You know, there are many, many examples. I can't think of all of them, but I can say that in terms of ecology, a land value tax is a favorable tax because it helps our thinking in terms of ecology and our use to protect lands, and also the desire to keep lands, you know, private. I'm very impressed with all the parks in London, just taking the buses around. See parks everywhere, which is wonderful. And I see that in New York City, the value estimate of Central Park, the one park in New York, is trillions of dollars that is in value that it's added by simply having and protecting that park that everyone uses every day. So I can go on and on in terms of ecology. Ecology works hand in hand with proper land use and with raising revenue from land values.
My name is Akhil Patel. I write about economic cycles based upon sort of the idea of land rent. Sorry, I just wanted to address the point about corporate profit. So you presumably would untax that, but companies like Google and so on make huge use of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is a form of natural resource, which generates additional sort of rents as the economy gets more productive, which would be presumably a focal point of the land value tax. And as well, they make use of data, which is kind of community generated as well. It's given freely, etc., which over time has more and more value. So maybe that's another source. My question was, we talked about the politics and so on, and there's sort of barriers at the political level. But are we getting to a point with kind of computational power and data and so on that maybe a private company could just basically value using sort of standard sort of techniques, just to value land across a city or a country relatively easily? You wouldn't have to wait a year. Maybe you could do it and write a funny program and do it in sort of half an hour. And then you'd sort of suddenly expose the enormous kind of potential for a taxation system just immediately. Do you think, and I know that I've sort of read some of your papers and I know that land appraisal requires a lot of careful study and so on, but just to get the high level sort of numbers out there, could you use kind of shortcuts to maybe sort of put some of this information out there?
The answer to your question is yes. Someone asked me about, well, how much effort does it take to value land? I said, well, typically if you have an assessor's office that values both land and buildings, they spend 90% of the year out measuring buildings and estimating building values. In a few weeks, they do all the land values because they're that simple to do. Right. It's all statistics, simple statistics. And it would be possible, and in fact there are several companies now in the United States that routinely value land for whole regions, for whole states, by using the statistics that are publicly available. So it's very easy to do, and you're right, it really should not take a year. It could be done, in months with the data that we already have.
But would people be able to, I mean, actually if you did it, for a tax, presumably people could appeal the value, there could be, you would, in that circumstance, you'd have to have a more sort of evidenced.
Yes, And you need time. Well, you're gonna have the evidence, because when you deal with people, you have all the evidence right around them. You have developed maps that show the values, and you have tables of land rentals and land sales that is the evidence that you have. And so they can look, like in this one jurisdiction, 60,000 people, we split it up into like a couple of hundred geographic units that have similar characteristics in them. And then within those units, we could come up with finalizing the value. But that was all really a computer-generated thing, developing the districts and then developing the land values in them and developing the characteristics. And I haven't talked about characteristics very much, but you know, like some people have problems. They have rocks to blast out and so forth, and those have to be reflected in the land value. So this, but most of this data is existing in public records, and it can be done quickly.
Zoopla could probably knock it out in a day.
My name is Jonathan Nichols. I have an interest in economics, in particular in the injustice of our current economic system. I just wondered why, at the beginning of your talk, you made it very clear that the value of land arises from the presence of the community, not from the particular activity of any individual within it. So that really underlines that the holder of any piece of land has no entitlement to put the rent in his own pocket, which is what goes on largely.
Mm-hmm.
So if he has no entitlement to put the rent in his pocket, and it really, because it belongs to the whole community, why do you suggest that 50% of the tax be collected? In other words, you are saying he can still pocket 50% of the community's money. Is that really, can you tell me why you say that?
I personally believe that 100% of the rental value belongs to all people in the community, and that we should collect 100% of the rental value. And I'm also saying is that I think it's going to be a period of years before the public understands what you just said, and that I'd be willing to accept steps along the way that collect less than a 100%. And I would go along with that as being a transitional necessity. But I think that your point is that, you know, God or some kind of force created the universe that we're in. No man had anything to do with that force. And all the mineral benefit, everything that we have, basically was created by this force. What man has done basically is
and a few women, I guess. And a few women.
Yes, and women. Have taken advantage of these sources, and that's great. That's right. But when a person excludes other people from a certain land site, they should pay for that exclusive use that they are obtaining, and that's what a land tax is, basically.
So you would advise that there's an incremental introduction that finally arrives at 100%, by which time the community would have realised the benefit of the direction in which you're moving.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sure, I'm Sam Teague, KCL. As I understand it, this is the only part of Canada using this system. Unfortunately, in the UK, we have a much more centralised way of governing things. But what I wanted to find out was, so say you were to just use the system in a part of England, let's say just a couple of counties which you introduced, do you actually see any disadvantages? I mean, do you see money migrate from British Columbia into other provinces, or they're called provinces or states? Do you see a disadvantage having this system in British Columbia and a different system in the neighbouring
we have a strange situation in the state of Pennsylvania in the United States, because there, cities can change their tax rates on land and buildings. And what we've noticed is that those cities that have higher tax rates on land and lower tax rates on buildings tend to be more progressive. They tend to provide better services and an enhanced environment for their people. And that's been written up several times by several people. So we do see people migrating to areas where the opportunities are enhanced by a land value tax. And I've always said that, you know, if one state were to do it, there would be immigration to that state. But just like in Great Britain, there is tremendous hesitancy everywhere to doing this. Even in Australia, where in Australia there's been a long history, over 100 years, you know, of land value taxation, still the amount collected is not enough to solve the social problems of the community, you know. It's what I want to see is getting people to more and more accept it, to where a larger share of revenue is derived from land values. And that will be when we really see changes occurring, where people then say, yes, this makes sense, here's proof of it. And we just haven't seen that much proof yet. I'd like to say that Great Britain is going to do it, you know.
But what about this point, let's picking up on the point that in Canada, one state has done it, and you saying that the state has been successful in doing it. Why haven't other states said, wow, that state's doing great, let's do the same? I mean, why isn't it spread when you've got a sort of demonstrator like that?
Well, four of the other provinces have copied to some degree what was, and they're the western provinces, have copied to some degree what has happened in British Columbia. But I have to be honest that in British Columbia, they're not collecting enough land rental to really show the full effects of this, you know. That you don't really have anywhere in the world that's showing this adequately. And so even in British Columbia, you don't have, where you do have the ability to raise all the revenue from land, they're still burdened with all the other taxes. They haven't gone all the way. So that's the negative part of what I said tonight, is, you know, although those of us who studied this, that spent their life in it, we understand it, we can communicate with it, we can show examples, but we can't say that, well, it's really been done here to the degree that, you know, would really make all the difference in the world.
And so, and also the one sort of other sales point you talked about was the that, you know, reducing inequality, which you suggested of rentiers increasing inequality. Are there any sort of studies that show that effect on inequality or reducing inequality due to land tax? Greater land tax?
There's an article written that deals with inequality in Harrisburg, and I believe that there's been other papers that have been touching on inequality, but there again, we don't have the best examples yet that can really sell the whole point.
And the idea was invented 150 years ago.
I agree. There was in Taiwan,
Yes.
in 1949, they introduced this to some degree,
Yep.
and about 12 years later, an American aid agency chairman said that the difference between the top and the bottom 10% had reduced by 50%. Published
So-
in a book called Economic Transformation of Taiwan.
So Taiwan is a good example that has dealt with the question of inequality, and it was done successfully there. So that might be a good example, and that was done largely because of the farming aspects and wanting to have equality in farming.
Okay. That's it.
I'm going to ask you.
my question is,
Please.
if you take a building like this, 90% of the value is probably the site.
You're right.
So that if you were to, say, tax, 50% of the rental from the rent that the actual landlord would get would fall, and the property value would fall correspondingly. So that the owner of this site would probably lose millions of pounds from the fact that the tax was going to be implemented in the future. Is this true, and is this one of the reasons why people lobby against it?
The owner of this property would only really benefit if all of the other taxes were eliminated. So that in essence, his contribution of 90% of, the land taxes here, would still offset his income taxes, his VAT taxes, and all the other taxes. And we always look at this not as a new tax. This is a way of eliminating taxes, not of creating taxes. And we're saying that if the community, should benefit by 90% of the revenue being on land here, that's great, and still the man, the company will have the building here and the wonderful location and the fact that it can generate rent and still produce income. So, you have to look at it in the long term and in the total way, What only makes it work is when you think about eliminating other taxes. And in California, in the test, there I had wonderful computer generations, computer data, and I used my computers. That was in 2011. Computers were pretty good, and I did all the comparisons. In San Francisco, for example, the typical home is 90% land, and in Los Angeles, it's 65% land, and so forth. Even in Orange County, where I live, it's like 60% land. So I did these charts where we were eliminating all the taxes in California, and I showed, like, if your lot was like 70% land, but you got rid of all these other taxes, you're going to be much better off. Your total taxes are going to be much, much lower. And there was only very few people that would actually pay higher, even though their land under their house represented almost all the value. They're going to be better off because of getting rid of all the other taxes. And that's a kind of a neat document that I did showing, and you can actually drew charts showing, who would be the losers and who would be the gainers. And virtually everyone was a gainer in California, even in San Francisco.
Sorry, well, who's that? Actually, we'll go.
Andrew Purvis, I'm a student here at the school. I think on one of your charts, you referred to $8 billion being collected in land value taxes in BC. Could you give us an idea of the percentage of total revenue for the state?
This was in California?
Was it California or?
I'm sorry, that was in British Columbia. Yeah, British Columbia.
2017.
Yeah, you're right. It was 8 billion total taxes, 4 billion land rent taxes. They still have all of the other taxes.
So as a percentage of total public revenue, are we talking 5%, 10%?
It's roughly 20%, 25%
20%.
of total revenue was land. They didn't do away with the sales tax, they didn't do away with the income tax, and so forth.
My name is Paul Entwistle, occasional economist and occasional attendee of this building in the past. I'll try and come to a question. I think Britain is bizarre in that we are relatively feudal in the area of assets and asset prices. prices. Any political discussion on inequality is steered by right-wing media towards income inequality, where you can have a fairly muddy debate on the subject. Question of asset inequality, which has a much higher Gini coefficient in this country, is steadfastly steered away from. You're probably aware that in the past there have been efforts here to introduce something called a mansion tax, which is a wealth tax above a certain threshold. And I'm informed, though I never checked, that in the lower reaches of the Labour manifesto in the last election, they were in fact proposing the land value tax, which the day after the release of their manifesto was branded the garden tax in all the right-wing newspapers, thus associating the risk of it with the 60% of the population who own property as opposed to the 35 to 40 who do not. My personal view is that the 11 MPs you spoke of were probably exactly right. There is a huge political penalty to pay in the current climate for introducing this, even though in my view the intellectual story is very well made, and thank you for your contribution to that. My question is, if we just take a simple, much lower tax on assets, the capital value of land, how poor an approximation is that, and why is that not what you're recommending? Is that a clear question?
Yeah, if I understand the question, you're saying instead of having a land rental tax, have a land value tax on the market value.
In that clearly the two are well associated.
And they're directly related.
Yeah.
So my answer would be yes, you could do that.
Okay.
And in fact, that's what was done in British Columbia. It was called a land value tax, not a land rental tax.
Because we're not good at complicated ideas here, not political.
So to answer your question, yeah, a land value tax or a land rental tax, you can express it either way. You're getting the same result. They're directly related.
Thank you.
And in the United States, it's almost universally a land value tax. It's not a land rental tax.
Hi, my name is Rina. I'm a student of economics and environmental policy at UCL. And I don't know much about the land, but I want to ask something about environment and the environment capital similar to discussion. I'm just wondering, is the damage to the environment taken into account of the land tax? Like some extreme examples like landfilling and nuclear power plants and other businesses that are going to damage the land for a long period of time. So I'm just wondering if this is taken into account of the land tax, or if it's a future trend or direction, or is it too difficult to do that in the system?
I missed your examples, but let me try to speak to it.
Like a landfill tax, so land is totally, is it a landfill where you dig down
a landfill.
Fill with garbage?
And what's the question about the landfill?
Well, would that be taken into account in some way in the land value tax? So people were, I don't know, paid more tax. Presumably, you'd want more tax on a land if someone was.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how does the system work, and if the tax is too high, then some of the companies they move their industries to some developing countries. So, is that a trend you can't stop? Or?
I guess the answer to that question would be that it takes smart, environmentally friendly people to figure out the ordinances and how things are done. And certainly, from my position, I would want to be sure that land which was not useful for most purposes, only that land could even be considered for environmental waste dump or whatever. Certainly, nothing that was ecologically valuable should even be considered or thought of. And you would deal with that problem You know, that's a serious problem that people have to sit down and figure out for themselves how to deal with landfills and where to have them and how to ensure that they don't do more damage and so forth. So I'm not an expert in that field. All I'm saying is that a land value tax will have the advantage of forcing people to think more positive about preserving the better parts of our environment and towards using land productively so that we have less land that requires to be used unproductively.
We've got a last question over there, and then we'll. I think we deserve a glass of wine. Certainly, Ted does.
Yeah, Karen Steele. My question's about a detail, really. What about the commons? You reminded me of this when you were talking about going around London and seeing all the parks.
Mm-hmm.
So presumably the parks enhance the value of the surrounding land for everybody in London.
Right.
So presumably you would expect anybody to pay any land value tax on those areas, and extending that to the countryside areas of great natural beauty. How would a land value tax treat those? It's a detail, but I'm just wondering how it would work, because you want to preserve it.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. However,
Well, take a park. So, I mean, if you owned a park, which actually, I suppose it's the reverse, isn't it? Because you're actually extending value around you as opposed
That's
to a
right.
property which the you're getting value from around. So it's the reverse.
It's commons, no one
Yep.
owns it.
I can give you a real example also, but let me say that the park enhances the value around, so certainly you want to preserve that. I had a group of 10 waterfront property owners in British Columbia. I'm sorry, no, this was in Greenwich, Connecticut, where I was the assessor more recently. They owned one property in common, and all the rest were their private residences. And I hit them with an assessment on their vacant lot, that was the same as all their other parcels. And they said, if we declare this a public park and create it as a non-exempt, never can be built upon and so forth, that will destroy the value. And I said, yes, and you won't pay any taxes. There'll be no taxes if you destroy the value forever. That's what they did. They created a park of their own on the waterfront that they all could use, and they did it legally under our statute in Connecticut, where they destroyed their own value rather than to sell it off to another homeowner.
And everyone could go to this park.
Yes. Yeah.
That's it. Brilliant. Well, I think we have really covered that topic very well, and it is fascinating, and it's been great having your insight around the world, your practical experience, and the detail of your knowledge, which I think really brings it home. Now, I suppose the question is, how do we make it happen in the context of that? But maybe that's over a glass of wine. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along, and thank you very much, Ted. And now we go downstairs, right to the basement, where there will be some wine and snacks and so forth, and further chance to talk about how to change the world. Thank you very much.